Before we begin, drop in the comments where you're watching from. And if you still believe that real heroes don't need applause to be great, go ahead and like and subscribe, because this one proves that silence can be louder than any speech. It happened on a Sunday, under gold-draped rafters and the kind of rented light that made everything look more important than it really was. At a wedding built like a press release, all glass smiles and name-dropping toasts, where Daniel Hartley, Dan, 79, father of the groom, sat alone at table 17 by the buffet, half-shadowed, unnoticed, and too polite to ask why he hadn't been called to say a few words. His black suit was pressed, but older than most of the guests, and the small, faded ribbon under his lapel drew more smirks than salutes from the crowd around him. Because stories had floated in over dinner, whispers that he says he was some kind of covert soldier, and claims he saved a bunch of lives, but can't even show a DD 214. And by the time the groom, Michael Hartley, tech executive, polished and proud, stood with his bride in front of the chandeliered arch, Dan's name hadn't been mentioned once, not by the officiant, not in the slideshow, and definitely not during the best man's speech, where the crowd erupted when Michael's brother-in-law raised his glass and said, "Here's to Mike, first in the family to really serve his country, if you count those defense contracts," and laughter rolled through the room like a fog, while Dan just adjusted the edge of his sleeve and gave a faint smile, like a man who'd heard worse and survived better. He never interrupted, never defended, just sat quietly with a glass of club soda and a plate of untouched cake. Even when the groom's new uncle, a lobbyist with too many stories and too few boundaries, staggered over to ask, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "Hey, Mr. Hartley, you ever actually shoot anyone? Or just file the paperwork?" And Dan just nodded once and replied, "Some jobs don't make the papers," which of course was followed by more laughter, more knowing winks, more half-sincere pats on the shoulder, as if they were playing along with a man lost in his own tall tales. What they didn't know, what they didn't bother to ask, was that Dan had spent over 20 years deployed in black zones, assigned to units that had no patches, whose missions still show up as denied operations in unredacted briefings, and that the one ribbon pinned to his jacket, the only one he was allowed to wear in public, was quietly reissued to him 2 months earlier under a new citation code, after a policy shift declassified parts of Operation Clay Ash, an incident so buried that even Congress never received a full briefing, and Dan had turned down the official medal ceremony in D.C. because, in his words, "I'd rather keep promises than collect applause." Still, the way people looked at him at the wedding, like an aging janitor who snuck into the reception, would have stung anyone else, but Dan just watched, smiling faintly at Michael and his bride, even as they kept glancing toward him and then away, like his presence was an uncomfortable footnote in a story they were trying to rewrite. Years earlier, Dan had tried to tell Michael a few things, when his son turned 15, then again after college, but Michael had always brushed it off as dad exaggerating again, too focused on ambition to hear the truth behind the silence. And by the time he'd built his career, built his image, Dan had become a liability to the story he told about himself, the mysterious veteran father who never talked about it, which became easier to leave out entirely. And so, on this day of vows and flashbulbs, Dan found himself seated next to a used-to-be sergeant major turned Lyft driver and the mother of the groom's hairdresser. His name is spelled on a cheap folded place card, while Michael's new father-in-law gave a toast about family legacy and service, never once looking in Dan's direction. The DJ skipped over the father-son dance, replacing it with a montage of childhood clips that ended with Michael's stepfather tying a tie in slow motion. Dan wasn't in a single frame, and still, Dan didn't say a word. He sat with a grace no one deserved and a patience none of them earned, never correcting, never raising his voice, even when someone at the next table said, "Why would a real war hero be riding the bus to weddings?" And someone else added, "If he was such a big deal, wouldn't the army have done something about it?" And Dan just sipped his soda, smiled, and murmured, "Sometimes the real work ends with silence, not a salute." And by the time dessert came, and the speeches were done, and Michael was posing with the groom's cake beside an ice sculpture that cost more than Dan's car, the quiet man at the back buttoned his jacket, reached into his coat for a small square envelope addressed to Michael in his own careful handwriting, and began walking out into the night, leaving behind the noise and the glass, stepping softly down the gravel path alone, until the wind changed, the air shifted, and a sound not found on any wedding playlist started to grow, louder from above, the unmistakable, steady, low pulse thrum of rotor blades. The low, steady thrum of rotor blades cut through the wedding chatter, drawing every eye skyward as a matte black helicopter descended deliberately onto the manicured lawn beyond the reception tent. Its unmarked body casting a silent shadow over the guests who paused, phones raised but unsure what they were witnessing. Out stepped 4 men in full dress uniforms, sharpened creases, gleaming medals. And led by a Marine colonel with a presence that demanded immediate respect, their purposeful march brought the crowd to an uneasy hush. The colonel halted at the edge of the tent and fixed his gaze on Dan Hartley, who stood frozen, clutching the envelope he'd planned to leave behind, and with a commanding hand gesture said, "Mr. Hartley, you are not dismissed." Whispers rippled through the crowd as the men carried a sealed shadow box, placing it carefully on the head table where Dan should have been seated all night. The colonel pulled a faded black and white photo from his folder, Dan in winter gear, flanked by a covert team in front of a Chinook helicopter, Operation Clay Ash faintly written beneath, and spoke without need for a microphone. This man's silence was mistaken for fiction for too long. A recording played, an official female voice declaring declassified mission details, success, 0 casualties, lives saved, decorations withheld under strict secrecy. The crowd's disbelief deepened as the colonel turned to Michael. "Your father led a mission no one knew about. You never asked, and he never needed to tell." Dan's past, once dismissed as fantasy, now stood undeniable before everyone, and as he opened the shadow box to reveal a rare, official medal and signed citations from 3 presidents, the room transformed from skepticism to solemn respect, one by one. Guests, including former ROTC friends and unseen veterans, rose and saluted silently, honoring a man whose quiet heroism outshone every toast and applause of the evening. The colonel concluded, "We brought the ceremony here because your son deserves to know the man who raised him." The DJ's music faded completely, the room filled only with the weight of truth, and as Dan stood quietly at last, the wind whispered through the tents, carrying a long overdue reckoning. Dan Hartley didn't rush to the mic. In fact, he didn't move at all at first, just stood there under the tent lights with his hands behind his back and his shoulders squared, not to impress, but because that posture had been trained into him the way silence had been, deliberately, permanently. The wedding crowd stood frozen, half in awe, half in shame, waiting to see if the man they'd all ignored would speak, and after a long breath, he did, but not from the stage, not with a mic, just from the center of the room in a voice steady and soft enough that somehow everyone leaned in to hear it. "I didn't come here to make a scene," he said. "I came here because I love my son. That's it. I never needed a spotlight." His eyes flicked once, just once, toward Michael, who now stood silent beside his bride, pale and blinking like a man who'd just been introduced to his own father for the first time. "But I've spent most of my life watching people celebrate the loudest person in the room," Dan continued, "and thinking the quiet ones didn't matter. I kept quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because what I did wasn't supposed to be talked about. You could hear a pin drop. My missions weren't on the news. They didn't come with headlines. But they kept people alive who never knew my name." A ripple of discomfort moved through the guests, like the air itself was adjusting. Michael took a step forward and asked, voice breaking, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Dan looked at him, not with judgment, but with something heavier, tired affection. "Because you were never supposed to carry it," he said. "You were my future, not my past." The colonel at the front stepped forward now and added, "Your father led Operation Clay Ash, one of the highest risk evacuations ever pulled off. No one died. No one talks about it. Because he followed orders and buried his legacy in silence. Until tonight, someone near the cake let out a stunned breath. Another man, who'd scoffed at Dan earlier, sat down slowly. Dan stepped to the table, touched the shadow box once, then turned back to the guests. "I didn't want a medal. I wanted to be here. I wanted to sit at my son's wedding, maybe dance a little, and be proud. That's all." Michael, eyes full now, walked forward and embraced him, really embraced him, and whispered something none of them heard, something that made Dan's hands twitch before finally wrapping around his son's back like the closing of a circle that had taken decades to complete. When they pulled apart, Dan smiled faintly and said, "Play my wife's favorite song, if you have it," and the DJ, still speechless, found the track, Unforgettable by Nat King Cole. Dan turned not to his son, but to the bride, extended his hand, and together they danced, slow, graceful, reverent, while the guests stepped back, watching a man they'd misjudged move through the room like he'd always belonged at the center. No one filmed it. No one dared speak. And when the music faded, the only sound was quiet tears and a single clink of a wine glass as one guest, an active duty soldier, stood and saluted. Others followed. Not a word. Just honor. Dan turned to Michael one last time, handed him the sealed envelope he'd tried to leave hours earlier, and said simply, "Open it when you need to know who you are." Then he walked out, not as a forgotten father, but as a man finally seen. The helicopter lifted slowly behind him, a silent escort in a sky that no longer ignored him. And by morning, no one remembered the cake flavor, or the groom's entrance, or the $8,000 string quartet. They remembered a photo, snapped quietly near the dessert table, of Dan Hartley, standing tall beside his son, shadow box under one arm, with the caption, "Turns out the quiet man in the back saved more lives than anyone in the room. We just never asked." And in Michael's office weeks later, above the framed photo and shadow box, hung a single quote from Dan's old field notes, etched in brass. "The loudest man isn't always the one who led us home.